Ever wonder what life was really like in the Middle Ages? Forget the knights in shining armor and the fairy tale princesses. What about the people living on the fringes, the ones who didn't fit neatly into a family portrait? Did you know some of the most essential and dangerous jobs were often held by people who chose or were forced to remain unmarried? And why would someone choose a life without a spouse in a time when marriage was practically universal expectation? Prepare to dive into a world you never knew existed, where devotion, danger, and dirt shaped the lives of those without rings on their fingers. Number 8. The solitary path of the monk and nun. Imagine a life where your days are entirely dedicated to God, where the ringing of bells dictates your every hour, and the only family you have is the community you live with. For many in the Middle Ages, this was the calling of the monk or the nun. It wasn't just a job, it was an entire way of life, chosen by some, imposed on others, and entirely centered around the solemn vow of celibacy, the promise to remain unmarried. Stepping into a monastery or a convent was like entering a world set apart. These weren't just places of worship. They were bustling centers of learning, charity, and often significant economic power. Monks, living by rules like the famous rule of Saint Benedict, structured their days around prayer, contemplation, and manual labor. They copied ancient texts, preserving knowledge that would otherwise have been lost to time. They brewed ale, cultivated fields, and ran hospices for travelers and the sick. The scriptorium, where monks meticulously copied manuscripts, was a silent, focused hub of intellectual activity, turning out beautiful illuminated books, one painstaking page at a time. This detailed work, requiring immense concentration and steady hands, often filled their hours. For men, joining a monastery might mean escaping the harsh realities of feudal life, avoiding military service, or pursuing a life of intellectual curiosity without the pressures of inheritance or marriage. For a younger son of a noble family, with no land to inherit, the church offered a path to power and influence. Often becoming abbots or even bishops, they gained education, access to books, and a stable, albeit austere, existence. Promise of spiritual salvation, of a life lived purely for God, was also a powerful draw for many. They took vows of poverty, obedience, and, most importantly, for our discussion, chastity. This vow meant no marriage, no children, no personal romantic relationships. Their devotion was solely to their divine calling and their monastic community. Women also found unique paths in convents. While their roles in society were generally more restricted than men's, convents sometimes offered an unexpected degree of autonomy and purpose. Noble daughters who couldn't be married off advantageously, or those who simply wished for a life beyond domestic duties, found refuge and opportunity within convent walls. Nuns performed similar duties to monks, though often with a greater emphasis on domestic crafts, charity work, and the education of young girls. They might manage vast estates, oversee complex finances, or become celebrated scholars and artists in their own right, like Hildegard of Bingen, a famous abbess who was a visionary composer, philosopher, and medical writer. For women, the convent could be a haven from the dangers of childbirth, the subjugation of marriage, or simply a place to pursue spiritual and intellectual development in a world that often denied them such opportunities. The monastic life was far from easy. It demanded strict discipline, self-denial, and a complete surrender of individual desires to the communal and spiritual good. Yet for thousands across Europe, from the windswept monasteries of Ireland to the grand abbeys of France, it was a chosen profession. It was a life built upon the very foundation of being unmarried, a choice that allowed them to dedicate their entire being to the Church and its work shaping the spiritual, cultural, and even economic landscape of the Middle Ages. Their legacy is seen not only in ancient manuscripts and soaring cathedral architecture, but in the very idea that a life without a spouse could be one of immense purpose and power. Number 7. The roaming blade, mercenaries, and professional soldiers. Imagine a life where your loyalty shifts with the wind, where your home is wherever your boots land, and where the clang of steel is your constant companion. This was the reality for thousands of mercenaries and professional soldiers in the Middle Ages. Unlike the feudal levies who served their lord for a specific period, these were career fighters, men who lived by the sword and sold their skills to the highest bidder. Their lives were a whirlwind of marching, fighting, and waiting, and the idea of settling down with a family was often an impossible dream. After major conflicts like the 100 Years' War that raged between England and France, vast numbers of experienced soldiers found themselves unemployed. Instead of returning to civilian life, many formed free companies, groups of hardened fighters who roamed the countryside, offering their services to kings, dukes, and even wealthy cities. These companies became a double-edged sword, vital for warfare, but often a terror to the local populace when not actively employed. They might demand protection money, raid villages, or simply consume resources as they passed through. Renowned for their ferocity and discipline, groups like the Swiss pikemen or the German Landsknechts became highly sought after their formations of long pikes, a formidable force on any battlefield. Why would such a life be dominated by unmarried individuals? First and foremost, the constant danger. Battlefields were brutal, unforgiving places, and the average lifespan of a soldier was short. To have a wife and children would mean constant worry for their welfare, and the high probability of leaving them as widows and orphans. The idea of forming a stable family unit was fundamentally at odds with the nomadic nature of their profession. Soldiers marched for weeks, months, or even years, from one campaign to the next. They lived in makeshift camps in the field or in garrisoned towns. There was no home in the traditional sense, no settled hearth where a family could thrive. Their economic situation was also precarious. While some mercenaries could earn good pay, especially if they were skilled and survived, their income was never guaranteed, depended on the availability of wars and the solvency of their employers. A sudden defeat, the capture of a leader, or a lack of funds could leave them penniless and stranded. Building up the resources to support a family, such as acquiring land or a permanent dwelling, was rarely possible. Many soldiers came from the lower strata of society, men who perhaps had no land or prospects at home, and the military offered a chance at a different kind of life, even if a dangerous one. They were often considered outsiders, even by the societies they protected. The stigma of a life of violence, of being a man of war rather than a farmer or craftsman, meant they were not always seen as ideal partners for marriage. Their social bonds were primarily with their fellow soldiers, their brothers in arms. This camaraderie was intense and often replaced the family ties that civilians relied upon. They shared the same dangers, the same hardships, and the same uncertain future. This created a strong sense of unit identity, a bond that was sometimes stronger than any familial connection. They might engage in short-term relationships in the towns they passed through, but these were seldom leading to permanent unions. The women who did follow armies, often called camp followers, were generally not wives, but rather laundresses, cooks, and women offering companionship or nursing. So while the image of the brave knight returning to his lady is a romantic one, the reality, for many professional soldiers and mercenaries, was a starkly different picture. It was a life of constant motion, brutal violence, and an ever-present specter of death. In this chaotic existence, the responsibilities and permanence of marriage were simply not compatible with the daily grind of the roaming blade, making them a significant group of unmarried men in the medieval world. Number 6. The dusty scrolls, university masters and scholars. Imagine dedicating your entire youth and then your adulthood to the relentless pursuit of knowledge, poring over ancient texts, engaging in fierce debates and traveling across lands just to attend lectures. This was the life of a medieval scholar and university master, a path that for many often meant deferring or entirely foregoing the institution of marriage. The 12th and 13th centuries saw the burgeoning of formal universities across Europe. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Salamanca. These institutions became vibrant intellectual hubs, drawing students and masters from all corners of the continent. Unlike the monastic schools, universities focused on specific faculties: theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts. To become a master, a scholar had to undertake a rigorous multi-year program of study, often beginning in their early teens and continuing well into their 20s, sometimes even their 30s. This involved long hours of reading, attending lectures, and participating in disputations, formal debates where students and masters challenged each other's arguments, all conducted in Latin, the universal language of scholarship. Many of the early university masters were clerics, meaning they had taken at least minor holy orders within the church. Even if they weren't ordained priests, these minor orders often came with an expectation of celibacy, particularly for those intending to teach or hold positions of influence within the ecclesiastical hierarchy that often oversaw universities. For instance, in places like the University of Paris, the faculty of theology was deeply intertwined with the church, and its masters were expected to remain unmarried. The renowned theologian Thomas Aquinas, for example, was a Dominican friar, bound by vows of celibacy. Even for those not formally ordained, the academic life itself often mirrored the asceticism of a monastic existence, with a focus on intellectual and spiritual purity. Beyond formal vows, the sheer demands of academic life often made marriage impractical. Becoming a master was a lengthy and financially uncertain journey. Students often lived in poverty, relying on patrons or meager stipends. Even after achieving mastery, a scholar might travel from one university to another, seeking new opportunities or debating with other prominent thinkers. This peripatetic lifestyle, moving from city to city, made it difficult to establish a stable home or family. A scholar's commitment was primarily to their studies and their students, a commitment that required immense time and mental energy, leaving little room for the demands of domestic life. Furthermore, the very nature of scholarly pursuits was often seen as solitary. Hours were spent in libraries, in quiet contemplation, or in intense, abstract thought. While university towns could be lively, the scholar's life was primarily an inward one, focused on the intellectual realm. The intellectual freedom and the unencumbered ability to travel and teach wherever their ideas took them were also factors. A married scholar, tied to a household and family, would have less flexibility and perhaps face financial pressures that could divert them from their academic calling. Not every scholar remained unmarried, of course. Over time, particularly in faculties like law and medicine, it became more common for masters to marry, especially as these professions became more established and financially secure outside of direct church control. However, for a significant period in the High Middle Ages, particularly among the most prominent theologians and philosophers, the path of the scholar was often a solitary one, intellectually rich, but personally unattached. They were the pioneers of formal education, laying the groundwork for modern universities, their lives a testament to the idea that the pursuit of knowledge could be as consuming and demanding as any other dedication, often requiring them to put away the thought of a conventional married life. Their legacy is not in family lines, but in the enduring ideas and institutions they left behind, the dusty scrolls they so diligently studied and expanded. Number 5. The motley man. Court jesters and wandering minstrels. Imagine a life where your job is to make people laugh, to sing songs and to tell stories, but where you also walk a tightrope between entertainment and defiance. You're constantly on the move, always an outsider, yet privileged enough to mock the most powerful person in the land. This was the curious and often solitary existence of the medieval court jester and the wandering minstrel professions, where the conventions of marriage often simply didn't fit. Court jesters, or fools, were unique figures in medieval courts. They weren't just simpletons. Many were sharp-witted, intelligent individuals who used humor, satire, and even physical comedy to entertain their lords and ladies. Their motley clothing and unusual status often granted them a unique kind of freedom, the license to speak truths that no one else dared utter, to critique power without fear of immediate retribution. They were the safety valve of the court, deflecting tension with a joke or a song. Some jesters were dwarves or individuals with physical deformities, whose appearance further set them apart and became part of their act. But their primary role was mental agility and wit. Minstrels, on the other hand, were the wandering entertainers of the age. They traveled from castle to castle, town to town, performing songs, reciting epic poems, juggling, telling stories, and sometimes even performing acrobatic feats. They were the newsbringers, the gossip mongers, and the cultural transmitters of a pre-literate society, keeping tales of heroes and villains alive and bringing new music and stories to isolated communities. Troubadours and quatrains in particular were renowned poets and composers, often performing their own intricate works of courtly love and chivalry. Why would these professions be dominated by unmarried individuals? For jesters, their status was often one of perpetual otherness. They were not truly servants, nor were they nobles. They occupied a strange liminal space. Their unconventional lifestyle centered entirely around their performance, and their lord's whims often precluded the establishment of a stable family. A jester's life was bound to the court. If the court moved, so did the jester. If a lord died or fell from power, the jester might find himself suddenly unemployed and without a place. This instability made it difficult to maintain a settled household or raise children. Furthermore, their role as an outsider might have made them less desirable as marriage partners in a society that valued social conformity and established lineage. Their very purpose was to disrupt norms, and that extended to their personal lives. For wandering minstrels, the reason was even more direct: constant travel. They were always on the road, earning their living piecemeal, never staying in one place long enough to establish deep roots. A minstrel might spend weeks traveling from one fair to the next, from one noble's hall to another, his only possessions being his instrument and a few changes of clothes. Such a life simply wasn't compatible with the responsibilities of a family. Wives and children needed a home stability and a steady income, things a wandering entertainer could rarely provide. While some minstrels might have had occasional companions or even families they visited infrequently, the vast majority were unencumbered by marital ties, allowing them the freedom to roam wherever their talent could earn them a meal and a bed for the night. Moreover, the social standing of entertainers was often ambiguous. While a successful jester or minstrel could be highly valued and well compensated, the profession was not always considered respectable by the landed gentry or even the common townsfolk who valued settled professions. This social perception could also make it harder for them to find a suitable spouse who would accept such a transient or unconventional lifestyle. They were figures of amusement, sometimes even reverence, but often viewed as separate from the established social order. So, while they brought laughter, music, and stories to the lives of medieval people, the jesters and minstrels often lived lonely, itinerant lives. Their dedication to their craft, their unique social position, and the very nature of their work meant that for many of them marriage was simply not an option, or a choice they willingly forewent for the freedom of the open road and the fleeting spotlight. They were the soloists of medieval society. Their stage the entire realm, and their only constant companion, their art. Number 4. The far horizons, long-distance merchants and sailors. Imagine spending months, even years, away from home, crossing vast oceans or treacherous land routes, facing storms, pirates, bandits, and unknown diseases, all for the promise of exotic goods and immense wealth. This was the reality for medieval long-distance merchants and the sailors who manned their ships. Their lives were defined by endless journeys and immense risks, making the stability required for marriage a near impossibility. The medieval world was far more interconnected than many realize, thanks to these adventurous souls. Merchants like Marco Polo, who journeyed to the court of Kublai Khan in China, spent decades of their lives on the Silk Road, bringing back spices, silks, and knowledge from the East. In Europe, the Venetian and Genoese merchants dominated the Mediterranean, trading with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world for luxury goods. Further north, the Hanseatic League, a powerful trading alliance of cities, sent their ships across the Baltic and North Seas, exchanging furs, timber, and fish for wine, cloth, and salt. For these men, the journey itself was the profession. A single voyage could take months or even years. Ships sailing from Venice to Alexandria might be gone for a year or more. A merchant traveling overland might take several years to reach China and return. During these extended periods, they were completely cut off from home and family. Communication was virtually non-existent. Letters took months to travel, if they even survived the journey. The concept of a modern family with daily interactions and shared domestic life was utterly incompatible with this nomadic existence. The risks involved were staggering. Shipwrecks were common, storms unpredictable, and navigational tools rudimentary. Piracy was a constant threat on the seas, while bandits plagued land routes. Disease was rampant, and unfamiliar climates could be deadly. Many merchants and sailors never returned from their voyages, lost to the depths of the sea or the perils of the road. To have a wife and children would mean constant anxiety about their future and the high probability of leaving them destitute. The financial success of their ventures was also never guaranteed. A lost cargo or a failed negotiation could wipe out years of effort. Furthermore, the very nature of their work demanded a certain level of independence. Decisions had to be made quickly, often in remote lands, without consulting a spouse or family back home. Their lives were a constant negotiation, a battle of wits against foreign traders, and a struggle against the elements. This required a singular focus and a willingness to embrace solitude. While they might engage in temporary relationships in the port cities or trading posts they visited, these were generally fleeting encounters, not the basis for a lasting marriage. The concept of a home for these individuals was often abstract. Their true community was often their shipmates or fellow merchants on the caravan. They formed strong bonds, forged in shared danger and ambition. When they did return, it was often with a burst of activity, settling accounts, selling goods, and preparing for the next journey. There was little time or inclination for the slower, more rooted life that a family required. Some wealthy merchants might eventually retire and marry, but for the majority of their active trading years, marriage was a luxury they could not afford, or a tie that would hinder their dangerous and demanding profession. These long-distance merchants and sailors were the veins and arteries of the medieval global economy, connecting distant lands and facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures. Their lives were an incredible testament to human endurance and ambition, but they were also lives largely unburdened by marital ties, allowing them the freedom and flexibility to chase profits and adventure across the far horizons of the medieval world. Number 3. the shadow dwellers, public executioners, and grave diggers. Imagine a job that forced you to live on the very edges of society, that made people whisper and cross themselves as you passed, and that involved the grim, necessary work no one else would touch. This was the fate of the medieval public executioner, and during times of plague, the dedicated gravedigger. These were professions of profound social stigma, often filled by individuals already on the fringes, and for whom marriage was a rare and difficult prospect. The public executioner, often known simply as the hangman, held a paradoxical position. He was a crucial figure in maintaining law and order, administering justice in its most brutal form, yet he was utterly reviled. His duties were gruesome: hanging, beheading, quartering, branding, or even torturing individuals accused of crimes. These were public spectacles meant to deter crime and display the raw power of the lord or king. The executioner was the instrument of this power, but also the embodiment of the horror. His hands were seen as unclean, tainted by death and violence. Grave diggers, particularly during devastating epidemics like the Black Death, faced an equally grim existence. When the plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population, cities were overwhelmed. Bodies piled up in the streets, and the sheer volume of dead meant that ordinary citizens could no longer handle the burials. Special teams of grave diggers were needed, often working day and night, risking their own lives to dispose of the deceased in mass graves. They were constantly surrounded by death, disease, and the stench of decay. Why were these professions so dominated by unmarried individuals? Primary reason was extreme social stigma. The executioner, for instance, was often forced to live outside the town walls, in an isolated dwelling. No respectable family wanted to associate with him, let alone marry into his household. His children would also face discrimination and ostracism, often unable to marry well or enter conventional trades. The role was sometimes hereditary, passed down from father to son, trapping generations within this cycle of isolation. It was a life of necessary service, but one that came at the cost of social acceptance. For grave diggers, during a plague, the stigma was compounded by fear of contagion. While they were performing vital work, they were also seen as being constantly exposed to death and disease. People avoided them, not just out of disgust, but out of terror. This isolation naturally made forming marital bonds extremely difficult. Who would willingly marry someone whose daily life was so intertwined with the macabre and the deadly, and who might bring disease into their home? Economically, these roles could sometimes be stable, particularly for executioners who received a regular salary or fees for their gruesome services. However, this financial stability rarely translated into social acceptance. They were pariahs, outsiders by necessity. Their lives were marked by a grim purpose, often chosen out of desperation or because they were already outcasts with no other options. Sometimes, the role of executioner was given to a pardoned criminal, someone already beyond the pale of conventional society. The psychological toll of these professions must have been immense. Constantly deal with death, suffering, and the darkest aspects of human nature would have been deeply scarring. Such a life would naturally lead to a certain detachment or isolation, making it harder to form intimate, loving relationships that marriage requires. Their bonds were often with their immediate families, if they had any, or with other marginalized individuals who understood their unique circumstances. So, while they performed essential, if horrifying, services for medieval society, the public executioner and the gravedigger often led lives of profound loneliness and social exclusion. Their necessary but reviled professions meant that for many, the idea of a conventional marriage and family was an unattainable dream, leaving them to dwell in the shadows, vital yet utterly shunned. Number 2. The whispering women. Accused witch healers and midwives. Imagine a woman in your village who knows the secrets of herbs, who can ease the pains of childbirth, or even brew a potion to help a lovesick youth. She's often an older woman, perhaps a widow or one who never married, living independently and drawing on generations of folk wisdom. In the medieval world, these women were essential to their communities, yet their knowledge and independence could also make them targets of suspicion, sometimes leading to accusations of witchcraft. For many of these wise women and midwives, marriage was not a defining feature of their lives, either by circumstance or as a factor that contributed to their vulnerability. Throughout the Middle Ages, long before formal medical training was widespread, local healers were the primary source of healthcare for common people. These were often women, inheriting knowledge from their mothers and grandmothers about the medicinal properties of plants, how to set a broken bone, or how to treat common ailments. Midwives, in particular, were indispensable. They attended births, a dangerous and often fatal event for both mother and child. Their expertise in managing labor, assisting with delivery, and caring for newborns was highly valued. They were trusted figures, privy to the intimate details of family life. So why might these crucial figures often be unmarried or vulnerable to accusations as such? The primary reason was their independent status. In a society where women were primarily defined by their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, or widows under the guardianship of a male relative, an independent unmarried woman with specialized knowledge could be viewed with suspicion. She didn't fit neatly into the patriarchal social structure. An unmarried woman, especially one with her own income from healing or midwifery, had a degree of autonomy that was unusual and, to some, unsettling. As the late Middle Ages transitioned into the early modern period, and as institutions like the church and formal universities began to professionalize medicine, often excluding women, traditional female healers came under increasing scrutiny. Their folk remedies and spiritual practices, once accepted, began to be viewed with suspicion. If a healing went wrong, or if a child died during childbirth, the blame could easily fall upon the independent woman who performed the service. Without the protection of a husband or a strong male family network, these women were more vulnerable to accusations of maleficium, doing harm through magical means. Many of the women accused during the initial waves of witch trials were indeed older, single, or widowed women. Their solitary lives, perhaps with a pet companion, which could be seen as a familiar spirit, and their independent economic activity often made them easy scapegoats during times of social anxiety, disease, or crop failure. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, a late 15th century treatise that fueled witch hunts, explicitly linked women's supposed moral weakness to their potential for witchcraft, often singling out those not bound by marriage as particularly susceptible to the devil's temptations. Their unmarried status was not necessarily a choice in all cases. Some might have been widows who chose not to remarry, perhaps preferring their independence. Others might have simply remained unwed due to circumstance or lack of opportunity. But once unwed, their ability to live independently through their skills, without a man to control them or provide a clear social role, could make them stand out. They were other, and in times of fear, otherness could be dangerous. These women were often the unsung heroes of medieval communities, providing care and comfort with their deep understanding of the natural world. But their very independence, often tied to their unmarried state, made them targets in a society grappling with fear and control. Their whispers of healing remedies sometimes turned into cries of accusation, a tragic example of how a woman's unmarried status could put her in peril during a time when her skills were both essential and paradoxically feared. Number 1. The endless grind. Apprentices and journeymen. Imagine spending 7 years or even more living and working under the strict eye of a master, often far from your own family, earning little to no wages, all while tirelessly learning a demanding craft Then after that, you might spend several more years traveling and working for various masters across different towns before you could even dream of setting up your own shop. This was the long, arduous path of the apprentice and journeyman in the medieval craft guilds, a system designed to delay marriage sometimes for decades. The medieval economy relied heavily on skilled craftspeople, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, shoemakers, bakers, masons, and countless others. To maintain quality and control trade, these artisans organized themselves into powerful guilds. The gateway to becoming a master artisan was through an apprenticeship. A young boy, typically between the ages of 10 and 15, would be formally indentured to a master. This meant he would live in the master's household, receive food, lodging, and training, but almost no pay. The contract would often last for a specific term, usually 7 years, but sometimes as long as 14 years. During this entire apprenticeship period, apprentices were strictly forbidden from marrying. The reasoning was practical and economic. The master was responsible for the apprentice's upkeep and training. A married apprentice would have divided loyalties, and the master would not want the financial burden of supporting a family unit. The focus was entirely on learning the craft without the distractions or responsibilities of marriage. They were considered part of the master's extended household, almost like adopted sons, but without the freedom of an adult. Once an apprenticeship was completed, the young man became a journeyman, from the French journey meaning day, referring to daily wages. Now, he could earn a wage for his work, but he still couldn't open his own shop. To gain further experience and broaden his skills, a journeyman was often expected to travel. This wandering period could take him across different cities and even different countries, working for various masters, honing his craft. This travel was essential for a well-rounded artisan, but it also meant he was still highly mobile and without a permanent base. Like the apprentice, the itinerant nature of the journeyman's life and the desire to save enough money to one day become a master meant that marriage was usually postponed. Becoming a master was the ultimate goal, but it was incredibly difficult and costly. A journeyman had to present a masterpiece, a complex item demonstrating his skill, to the guild for approval. He also needed to pay a substantial fee to the guild and have enough capital to set up his own workshop, buy tools, and purchase raw materials. This could take years, or even decades of saving. By the time a journeyman finally became a master, he might be in his late 20s, 30s, or even older. Only then, with a stable income and a recognized position in the community, could he realistically consider marriage and starting a family. The system ensured that only the most dedicated and skilled individuals rose to the top. But it also meant that a significant portion of the male working population, from their teenage years well into their adult lives, remained unmarried due to the structural demands of their profession. Their lives were a continuous cycle of learning, working, saving, and aspiring, with the promise of a family often deferred to a distant future. The grind was endless, but it also built the foundations of the medieval economy, one meticulously crafted item at a time, often by hands that had yet to wear a wedding ring.